Welcome to Real Talk, episode 27. I am Brian Rose, and you are here at London Real Studios. And for the next 30 minutes, we're live. We're here to answer your questions. And today, we're going to talk about Brexit. It was a pretty historic result we got on Friday. And I'm lucky to be joined by our good friend, Mr. Jeff Lynn, the CEO and co-founder of Cedars. He's also a non-executive director of Companies House. You would have seen him twice before on Silicon Reel. And Jeff, first of all, thank you so much for being here.
Brian, thanks so much for having me. Good to be back.
You know, there was a lot of people that I kind of wanted to have in here and talk about this issue. We've actually got former Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, in tomorrow. But you wrote an article that seemed to get a lot of people talking. And it was called A Note to My Friends Who Voted Leave. You posted it on Medium. And I think you just articulated a lot of the ways that you were feeling. And so I thought, why not have Jeff in here? You've made some really interesting points about Brexit, and we're going to go through them today. But thanks so much for being here. Can you tell me a bit about that article? And then also, the thoughts of you and the tech community kind of up until this vote happened and then on Friday.
Yeah, absolutely. So the article is kind of funny. I didn't mean to write an article. And I'm not usually somebody who sort of writes for cathartic purposes, but I have a lot of really good friends, really dear friends, people who mean a tremendous amount to me, who are highly educated, who are very similar to me in a whole lot of regards, but who were strong supporters of the Leave campaign. And we didn't really talk about it that much during the campaign, but once it was all over, I just felt a need to sit down and kind of write a note to them and just share what I was thinking. And I really wanted just to be engagement with them and basically to say to them, look, there's a lot on you now. Like, you've made a decision that by all accounts looks very improbable. Prove us wrong, prove yourselves right, because if you don't, the consequences are really quite severe. And I was really just going to post it on Facebook, but I got to rambling and it got too long for just a Facebook update, so I put it on a Medium. And a lot of people seem to have engaged with it. Interestingly, the folks that I kind of wanted to read it, I don't know if they've read it or not, I haven't heard anything from them, but a lot of people, particularly from the kind of Remain community, have really engaged and given me a lot of compliments on it, which is nice. It is what it is. It's a very emotive and serious issue, and I was glad to have the chance to write something that people have found interesting.
And it was emotional. I mean, I just reread that article again today. I saw it the first time a couple days ago. And, in the beginning, almost every couple paragraphs, you're kind of saying, this is really on you to prove us wrong. We're going to work together on this. Yep. But there's a lot of ramifications about this decision. And, you went through about 6 different areas. But, it's passionate.
Yeah, and one of the things I've said a number of times in different talks and all is that the convert makes the biggest evangelist, and that's as true in religion as it is in nationhood. I mean, I moved to Britain over 10 years ago. I've become a citizen. I really love this country. I mean, I really, really have a tremendous attachment to it. I think it is a brilliant country. I think I see maybe certain things in it that people who were born here may not see, and the prospect that we may have just really shot ourselves in the foot and undermined a lot of the great things that have happened here in recent decades and centuries, for that matter, that concerns me and it upsets me. And I feel that I could be wrong. I don't pretend for a moment to be infallible, but I want those who have supported Leave to own up to the fact that there's a very big responsibility on their shoulders now. They will have, I think, complete support of everybody in the country, or at least they should. We're going to do everything we can to make it work. I think it can work, but I think it's a really big uphill battle. And what I don't want is people sort of shirking away from that. I think that we need to be blunt and honest about what we've just done and what we need to do ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived here a total of 17 years now. I'm a citizen just like you, and I always remind my homeborn compatriots here that I am a citizen just as much as anyone else, and I love this country. I think London's the greatest city in the world. I love it so much I named my show after it, and this is home for me, and I love so many things about it. I always describe London as this incredible city that almost like when I got here, it was like in its early teens, and now it's like blossoming in its early 20s, and it's like really becoming, the most international city, the most cosmopolitan city, and just a place that I'm just so proud of. And so when something like this happens, it just makes me really just regroup and rethink. And I've also tried to also think about, okay, who are these people that voted leave and why, and do we need to listen to them as well? So I'm trying to open my mind up, but it's been hard, especially since I'm in the media and I'm in the new media where it's all about us all becoming more like one, and they're not being gatekeepers like the BBC or news organizations. And I find like this show really connects people.
Right.
And when I find us dividing, my knee-jerk reaction is it doesn't feel like the right thing. So let me just ask you, I'm ex-finance, you're ex-legal. When we look at the pound and the financial markets, we look and open up and, these markets are down 10, 15%, sometimes 20+% in bank shares. For us, it seems patently obvious that this might have been a bad move and it hurts everyone. But maybe people that voted in Sunderland don't feel the same way. What's your read on those feedback loops?
So it's interesting. I'm actually very relaxed about short-term market movements and even short-term currency movements. I mean, I really don't. For what they are in and of themselves, let the speculators worry about that. I don't think it really matters. But what I think really does matter is the long-term health of the economy, and I really believe very, very, very firmly that pretty much everything else derives from an economy. If you have a strong, robust economy that allows you independence, that allows you to, social services and social benefits, it allows you to do a lot of the things that you want to do for society. And if you don't have a strong economy, then the best of intentions, you're not going to wind up having the level of independence or being able to provide the level of services to your people that you want. So to me, it comes down to a long-term economy. And what is so shocking to me is, whatever the initial reactions are, all they are is really indicative of a broader point, which is that virtually everybody who knows anything about economics or about business said that this was a bad idea. I mean, and one of the points I made in my article is that it is very difficult to think of a time when there has been quite such a unanimity of opinion by people on all parts of the political spectrum who were actually in positions to understand the ramifications. And I know Michael Gove says that people are tired of experts, but that's kind of meaningless. I mean, people who actually have domain expertise know things and they understand implications, and I think that the fact that we have just completely ignored them in this case was a very, very dangerous thing to do. So does it affect the guy up in Sunderland? Yes, it does, because if we have a weak economy, we wind up with less job creation, we wind up with, the markets may well affect his or her pension, but even if he or she isn't exposed to the markets, you're going to have less job creation, less opportunity to consume at good prices, and less good social services. I mean, contrary to the idea that we're going to wind up spending the EU budget on the NHS, a weak economy with weak tax revenues will do nothing other than to undermine the NHS, which I think is one of the great institutions we have in this country. So I really do think that the economic implications, not short-term but long-term, are critical to everyone who lives in the country.
One of the points in your article is you said, let's look back to the 70s, where Britain wasn't in the position that it is now, and it really was the sick man of Europe, as you said. And I still remember people telling me stories of in the 60s of them eating by candlelight because the economic shock was still so great after World War II. I think it's something very hard for us to conceive. You talk about the fact that this union was helping that economy come along. Can you just talk a little bit more about that historically?
Yeah, look, I think there are sort of two overlapping elements to it, and I should also say, interestingly, and it may be surprising, that I've always considered myself something of a Eurosceptic. I think there are a lot of challenges in the European Union. I've never been a sort of rah Brussels type of person. I think that there are issues, but I think that there has been a huge amount that has outweighed that and made it worth it. And fundamentally, it has been about free and unfettered access to a 500 million person market. The reality is that from a regulatory perspective, from a talent access perspective, many people may see immigration as a bad thing. From an economically, I see it as being able to hire the best and the brightest from all over Europe. And in so many other ways, being part of that market, I think, has been a major, major boost to the economy. Has it been the sole factor? No. Could we have done well on our own? And did we really turn the corner in the 70s just because we joined what was then the common market? One of those counterfactuals that's very difficult to answer. But I do think that where we look at our position today, our economy is closely tied with that of Europe. The free and open borders that we have had have been critical to that. And throwing that away simply jeopardizes our prosperity.
You said if it was '04, you might be voting for Brexit, but since we allowed those peripheral members in the EU, it seemed to have kind of taken some of the the power away from, say, the Germans and the French, and it kind of really normalized it. One of the comments we got is that how come this started off as a trade union and turned into a political union? But in your point you made in the article, this has been a good thing for Britain because it kind of normalized a lot of those policies.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, and having studied law, a lot of the law studies I did was in European EU EC law, and having studied that and from that background, I'm conscious that over the course of the 80s and 90s, a fairly annoying thing happened, actually a quite seriously annoying thing happened, which was we joined what we thought was a trade area, and then without a whole lot of democratic accountability, it kind of kept seeping into other areas. And I think that generated a whole generation of frustration, and a frustration that I'm fairly sympathetic with. We thought we were getting one thing and we got something different. But 2004 was a really cataclysmic change because suddenly there wasn't enough unity within Europe to really deepen that level of integration. The sort of German, French, Benelux, Italian bloc that had formed the core of Europe no longer had enough power to impose what it wanted to see in the way of Europe. And particularly the Eastern European countries, whose accession Britain has supported tremendously for exactly this reason, were much more interested in restoring it to being a fundamentally trade-oriented, open market, free movement type of zone, rather than a number of the additional pillars that had been proposed and considered. And I think that's really critical. And what we've seen in the last 12 years and my interactions in Brussels and just reading the paper is that many of the things that people used to really worry about, even if it's still talked about, even if it was still on the agenda, these weren't things that were being implemented in practice. And I think that there was a real failure among many people to recognize that shift that has taken place, that the EU of 2016 is very different than the EU of 2004 was.
Immigration, huge issue here. We got two immigrants talking about immigration. When I see immigration, I guess I maybe see something different than maybe someone who was born in this country who lives in London, and maybe something different than someone, say, was born in this country, and I guess I'm picking on Sunderland because I read an article in The Guardian about Sunderland,
Sure.
and they had, I think, a 70% leave vote. What's your read on immigration?
Look, I think it's a very tough issue, and I am, again, probably more sympathetic than some on the Remain side might be with a lot of the concerns that were raised. And I do genuinely think that the refugee crisis is a very serious one. I think that even non-EU immigration, when it's from very different cultures, there are problems that emerge there. It's not, I don't think you're at all racist or xenophobic to say that if you have large numbers of people from a vastly different background all coming in very quickly, that there are frictions that can get caused there, and I'm sympathetic with that. But when we look at real EU immigration, when we look at what was, what was actually coming in and what was actually happening, I'm sure that there are particular regions where job displacement or wage pressure was really being felt. But I don't think that the kinds of emotive reactions people had to immigration married up with the practical effect of who was actually immigrating from Europe. And, in London, obviously we're biased because we know people of all different walks of life, all different backgrounds, all different socioeconomic statuses from all over Europe, and are generally friends with them, and they're part of our life. But even in communities that are maybe a little bit more segregated and where there's a little bit less integration, I don't believe, I've certainly never seen the evidence to indicate that there was any real serious either strain on services or other forms of disruption to British life, except perhaps in some very microcosmic ways. And I think it gets borne out a bit by the fact that a number of the people who have been interviewed, and I appreciate that this may be a media slant, but a number of the people who have been interviewed who voted leave, have expressed that their concern was immigration, but when actually pushed on it, saying things like, well, we don't, we want to stop the Muslims from coming in. Well, I think that's, putting aside the fact that that's an unacceptable view to begin with, it's also factually wrong, in the sense that the people they were worried about weren't able to immigrate under EU rules. So I think there was a lot of confusion around it, and I think that if we had really borne down and said, what is the real impact of EU immigration, and what are the positives versus the negatives, it's very hard for me to see any world in which the positives didn't outweigh the negatives.
I remember hearing a comment of someone saying, yes, someone's going to emigrate from one of these Eastern European countries to move to England to collect benefits. And I've just never seen that story happen. Now, we're a bit biased. I mean, in the tech community, some of our greatest programmers come from Romania and a lot of these places. If not, we outsource the work there, and there's just so much input from these immigrant community. But I don't hear about evidence from there.
And the data that I've seen is that the number of EU migrants that were here claiming benefits and not attempting to work, it was just minuscule in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it makes great sort of salacious news, the sort of benefit street type, television shows and all. But when you're talking about real numbers and real impact on the economy, it's really minor. And in my own experience, and this is anecdotal, but what I've seen through the years is that I think immigrants tend to be pretty hardworking people. I mean, I think picking up from a home where you have a family, where you have people around you, and going to another country, often on your own, often not speaking the language very well, it's really hard. And that tends to be done by people who really want to make a better life for themselves. And maybe it's just my own sort of bias. Maybe there's the American sort of history and experience seeping in there as well. But by and large, I think immigration, particularly from countries with similar cultural and historical backgrounds, is usually a good thing, and I think it has been here.
And arguably necessary in any economic boom.
Exactly right.
I mean, you said you started in America. I mean, if you look at the service industry jobs, say here, the Uber drivers, the cleaners, the this,
Right.
it's people from outside the union, and someone needs to do these jobs to keep this economy
Exactly
rolling.
right.
You see the same in the U.S., in illegal Mexican immigrant, and that actually runs a huge part of the economy. A lot of companies wouldn't exist without that. You also said that once you kind of play that immigrant card, you kind of jump in bed with the UKIPs of the world, and maybe even the Trumps of the world, and that's a tricky thing. What did you mean?
Well, look, I one of the points that I was very keen to make, and am very keen to make, is again, when I think about the people in my friends, people who I care about, who voted Leave, I don't think a single one of them is a racist. I don't think a single one of them is xenophobic, and I think that some of the sort of clamoring that that the Leave campaign was entirely motivated by racist type views is deeply unfair. And I do think if you look at many of the leaders of the campaign, Boris, Michael Gove, Daniel Hannan, I mean, these are thoughtful people. I may disagree with them, but these are thoughtful, open-minded people. The problem is that didn't add up to 52% of the country, and I think a very, very significant portion of the country was more motivated by the UKIP and perhaps even worse elements that really, you can use whatever euphemism you want for it, but that really were motivated by a dislike of foreigners and a desire to keep Britain Anglo-Saxon. Putting aside the fact that Anglo-Saxons were foreigners to begin with, the reality is that there is an important undercurrent of some very nasty tendencies within that group. And what concerns me about that, and a couple of the comments I've received, which are very fair, is you can't be judged always by the people who vote for you. Am I happy with everybody who's ever voted the same way I have in an election? Of course, the answer is no. But the problem is they've now got to build a bit of a coalition, and as we come up with practical solutions, they're going to have to respond to the fact that there are a number of people who very much do not want, in that Leave coalition, who very much want to slow immigration effectively to a trickle. And I would venture to say, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but I would venture to say that a Daniel Hannan or a Michael Gove would in principle have been supportive of an EEA type membership, so what people talk about is the Norway solution, where you have effectively access to the free market and effectively maintain free movement of people. Maybe that's not a fair characterization of their views, but there are certainly those in the Leave campaign who I think would have been open to that. But that's not on the table. That's going to be an impossibility given where most of the Leave campaign support came from. The reality is that there's a huge portion of the campaign that wants to keep the foreigners out, and the more progressively minded or open-minded members of the campaign are going to have to listen to that. And I think that's, as I said, sort of has put them into bed with people that perhaps they didn't necessarily want to be there with.
One of the things I saw with this vote is that, in a way, it felt to me like a lot of these peripheral cities and some people outside of the big cities, the people not in Birmingham, not in London,
Right.
It's a way of them saying, we're no longer happy with the representative we're getting at Westminster,
Yeah.
even from the business leaders. And this was almost a vote against the establishment. And this walled city of London that makes all the rules. Okay, it's responsible for 20% of the GDP, but we just don't think you are serving our interests. And maybe they chose the wrong way to express that frustration. But do we not need to listen to that?
I actually think we really do. And interestingly, I probably, I am in some ways more sympathetic with the people who are from more deprived communities, or just communities where there's a feeling that things could be a heck of a lot better, and who are voting this way as a rebuke to what they perceive to be the establishment, than I am to the establishment types who voted that way. And look, I think the reality is that much of provincial Britain, much of many of the formerly great cities, have declined very significantly since the 1970s. Depending on which side of the aisle you sit on, if you're on the left side, you would blame Thatcherite policies. I myself am a conservative. I happen to be a fan of Margaret Thatcher, but I don't think that changes the fact that the forces of globalization and market pressures did result in a very significant shift in the economy to the south and to the east, and away from the traditional industrial heartlands. And I don't think any government in this country has done nearly a good enough job at trying to revitalize those regions, just as in America, the Rust Belt and other areas that were once industrial cores haven't been revitalized. It's a problem throughout the West in many ways. So I'm very, very sympathetic with those who are frustrated with that, and I think it's a real wake-up call that we need to think much more about the issues of post-industrialization throughout much of the country. But I still think this was the wrong way to express it, and I do think a representative democracy makes a heck of a lot of sense. And I have a lot more sympathy, for example, as I say, I'm a conservative, I don't support the man, but I have a lot more sympathy for those who would vote Jeremy Corbyn in as a representative way of expressing a different socio-political viewpoint on the world than doing something that's like a Leave vote that I think is going to ultimately undermine their cause.
Where do we go from here, and what's been the community reaction from people here in London, in the tech startup community and just in the general business community, and what do you think happens in the next year?
So I think there's a huge difference between the tech startup community and much of the rest of the community, and I sort of wear two hats in this regard. I think the tech startup world is going to be fine. I think the nature of entrepreneurs is to be innovative, is to pivot as needed, is to react to change. We, and I count myself in this, and Cedars, are among the businesses best positioned to react to this kind of stuff. We're lean, we're agile companies, and we're in a great state in being able to respond. And whether that means moving some jobs to Europe, whether it means taking different approaches, who knows? But we'll all be fine. I think the broader business community and just the broader sort of London community feels a real sense of sadness. Feels a real sense that after being on a great trajectory for a number of years, both culturally and economically, that the wind has come out of the sails. I don't think anybody seriously believes that Britain is going to become a third world nation. It's nothing like that. But it's just that, as I said in my little post, we've punched way above our weight for a long time. I mean, as a medium-sized island nation, we've got one of the biggest economies in the world. We've done really, I think, tremendously well. And whether we continue to sort of see that kind of success, only time will tell. I very much, as I say constantly, I hope I'm wrong. I hope those of us on the Remain side got it wrong, and that there are going to be wonderful opportunities ahead. But I think that if you're coming at this from a general business community perspective or just a general kind of Londoner perspective, I think there's just a sense of sadness and disappointment.
Will London turn into a Singapore type model? Will it be its our own little city-state here? Again, it's responsible for 20% of the GDP. It's a very strange relationship this city has with the rest of the country. And then thoughts on that and the finance industry, which is a big part.
Yeah, well, and I think the two are very, very closely tied. I mean, I think that there's a real question about what happens to the finance industry, because in the absence of the financial services passport that allows financial services businesses to operate all across Europe under a single regulation, the London finance industry will shrink very, very dramatically. And there may be those who think that that's a good thing in terms of rebalancing the economy. My own view is that this has been a great British success story, and that I'm in finance. I see nothing wrong with finance as an industry when done right and when done ethically, and it's a huge contributor of tax revenue. So I do think that we stand a real risk if there isn't an arrangement in the Brexit settlement, and I don't know how there will be, to maintain the passport, that the financial industry goes. And then that does sort of go on to what is London, and what do we want London to be. And I have to say, the thought of London becoming a Singapore type state, I don't think that had ever crossed my mind before Friday. And then people started talking about it in the Londependence movement, and I find it oddly alluring. And I don't like feeling, I do believe in the union here, but at the same time, I'm very sympathetic with the Scots if they want to go. When they had their referendum in 2014, I was very much hopeful of their decision, but I was very much hopeful that they would stay in the UK, and was glad that they did. Today, I'm hugely sympathetic if they want to go. I'm sympathetic with the pressure that comes from Northern Ireland, and I find the idea of London having certainly a level of devolution, which the mayor has already called for, but even a level of sort of autonomy and independence, maybe that's the right way. Maybe we have become so different here in London from the rest of the country that it's that's the way it has to go.
Talk to me about the rest of Europe. I think Angela Merkel tweeted out "damn" on her Twitter when she heard the news on Friday. I don't know if that was prepared or not, but it was pretty incredible. I think the biggest loser from this is Germany, because they are selling this idea of a union. And again, of course, everything is an idea. And if you get everyone backing it, something like that can work. But with Britain leaving, it's hard to keep this whole piece together, which gives them a lot of control and gives them, a lot of potential prosperity. What's their reaction?
Yeah, I think everyone's concerned. I think people are nervous, and I think there is that same sort of sadness and disappointment that maybe many in London feel is felt throughout Europe, and probably even more in Europe than here. There's a real belief in the European project. I mean, the fact that Europe has avoided going to war with itself for 70 years is historically a very unusual thing. And while you can't attribute that entirely to the EU, that's where its origins come from. And the level of cooperation we've seen across Europe in the past 70 years is a historical anomaly, and a lot of people feel very passionately about the fact that we've maintained that. So I think the disappointment felt across the continent is palpable. My own prediction is Europe's actually going to be just fine. I mean, I don't think for a moment that the wheels are coming off. I mean, I think that the Eurozone has some very serious problems, and the common currency, without a sufficient level of fiscal and political integration, has been a really problematic project, and thank goodness we never entered that. And what happens to the Eurozone, we will have to see. But I think the EU is going to be absolutely fine. I think that they are going to, maybe this creates a bit of an initiative or an impetus for some reform, which is much needed. I think that would be great. But I think the 27 remaining member states are going to soldier on and continue to be the world's biggest market, and frankly take a lot of advantage from that.
70 years without a conflict, it's a pretty impressive record for Europe. When I see things like this, all of a sudden it's, Scotland leaving, Northern Ireland comes into the fray again, and it just seems like if there's any beginning of a fractured, Europe, it's like, it looks like it's starting now.
And I think that's right. And obviously we all think these days in terms of, we don't think in terms of war on our home soil as being realistic, and obviously it's not going to happen overnight, but there are real security threats. I mean, a weakened Europe is a great enticement to Putin and to many others who have very bad designs on it. And also, we've had periods of peace before that have been shattered by complacency. From 1871 and the Franco-Prussian War through to 1914, that was a good 43 years of peace, and I think people got fairly complacent, and then all of a sudden, overnight, we all know what happened. So I do think that the security implications and the prospect of long-term conflict, while it's not the most immediate and pressing concern, I think it does hang out there.
One of our viewers, David Cole, said, Brian, can Britain become something like a Switzerland? My brother lives in Switzerland, works for a computer company there, and they enjoy this kind of interesting status where they have their own currency, yet they still have what it looks to be trade agreements that keep things in place, some immigration. Is it possible for us to negotiate that type of a deal?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the answer is I hope so. I mean, I think that's probably the best case scenario that comes out of this. And if we can, then great. But I think it's tough. I mean, Switzerland has a very unique history. It's long maintained neutrality. It's unusual geographic position. It's unusual cultural and ethnic makeup, among other things, linguistic makeup. Make it a bit of a unique case. And a lot of these relationships developed over a number of years. Are we going to be able to sort of recreate that in a relatively short to medium period of time? Again, I hope so. I mean, I genuinely hope so, but I don't have a huge amount of optimism for that.
Okay. I mean, there's a company in the States called Strat4, it's short for strategic forecasting, and before the vote, they said it was Britain's call option and that they can use this to refortify and to negotiate things in their interest and push on and be stronger after that. You're not seeing that.
Well, I struggle to see how we wind up in a position of strength now. I mean, I think that, we've got a strong economy. Sure, there are a lot of people who will want to trade with us. But instead of being a key part of a 500 million person market, we are now a standalone 60 million person market. I think that in our negotiations with Europe, they have a significant amount of leverage. I know that there are countries like Germany that have a trade surplus with us and will want to keep that. But fundamentally, the European bloc, I do believe, has a significant amount of power over us. And I think the notion that we're going to be able to negotiate this from a position of strength is a fallacy. Will we be able to make up with it elsewhere? Will we get good trade deals with Canada or the United States or elsewhere? Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of opportunities, and I hope they're seized. But geography is important. Europe is our closest neighbor. It's by far our biggest trading partner. A huge amount of our economy, as it stands today, is intertwined with Europe, and that's where I think the economic success of this project, this Brexit, is going to be felt most.
One of our viewers, Haley Selassie, says UK won't be a top 15 economy by 2025. Agree or disagree?
Well, first of all, I'm very impressed that Emperor Selassie is submitting questions to you. You have some audience, particularly because he's been dead for a number of years. No, well, look, I mean, I am not an economist, and I think part of the issue that I've had here is I don't know. I don't know what economic outcomes are going to look like. I just think that the fact that the overwhelming expert opinion was in one direction really mattered. If I had to guess, hard to guess. I think that the notion that we will remain the fifth largest economy, or sixth, as I gather we may now be, is hard to fathom. I think that we're going to see a meaningful drop, and with that is going to come a drop in living standards, a drop in our ability to provide social services, and much else.
I was in New York City when 9/11 happened, and every single deal that was pending stopped.
Yep.
Regardless of whether it had any correlation to that event whatsoever.
Yeah.
And we saw just stagnation in economic activity for a couple of years there. Is the same thing going to happen in London? I know you're painting a very optimistic point of view when it comes to tech startup, but tech startups, the last thing they need is uncertainty.
Yep.
They're inclined to close funding. In a weird way, they're not at the bottom of the food chain, but they need all the optimism they can get. And they need the immigration sometimes. I see this having potential ramifications.
Look, I think short term, let's say the rest of the summer, sure. I think that, you're going to see a bit of a slowdown in funding over the next couple of months, particularly from institutional capital. We're not seeing a slowdown on Cedars as of yet, and I don't know that we will because we have such a broad base of investors. But I think that, until we get to the autumn, until we have a sense of what party leadership looks like, and until we have the beginnings of a view as to what a deal might look like, I think everything will slow down, not just in tech, but across the board. I think longer term, it's going to depend on two things. One is going to be what the settlement actually looks like. And, with immigration, maybe there's an opportunity. I mean, one of the challenges that we've had in recent years has been because of the government's desire to keep net migration numbers low, or lower, and the fact that there was no control over European immigration, it has been next to impossible to bring in talent from anywhere other than Europe. And if we can get to a settlement that makes it easy to recruit the sorts of people that we would want from Europe, but also makes it easy to recruit people from around the world.
AKA India, US?
India, US, China, you name it. I mean, anywhere. They're talented, smart, young people and old people. I mean, live everywhere in the world. And, an ability to bring them in under a regime that's far more open than it is today, I think would be fantastic. Do I really believe that that's going to happen? Well, going back to the point about who many of the Leave supporters were, I don't believe that the Farage crowd is going to be very happy with the notion that it is now easier to bring Indian and Chinese and Middle Eastern folks into the country, which is a shame. But if that were the outcome, great. I think if we don't wind up with a good outcome there, look, I think that the European tech sector will continue to flourish significantly. We've been for a long time a multipolar tech ecosystem in Europe, with London as probably the biggest component of it, but with Berlin, Stockholm, Paris, Amsterdam, so many other places. And I think we may just wind up seeing a rebalancing. In our case, we are an Anglo-Portuguese company. About half our team sits in Lisbon today. Our Amsterdam office opens tomorrow, or Friday, by complete coincidence. We and many other tech companies, have pan-European presences, and so we'll be fine as companies. The question is, where will we be largely based, and where will a lot of our business come from? And that may be to the detriment of the UK.
Final thoughts. Cameron, were you surprised he resigned on Friday?
It was a little bit of a surprise, but I think he had to do it.
Right.
I don't think
if he hadn't it would have been demanded by now.
I think that's right.
By not inducing that Article 50, is there a way that he's finding a way out of this, or do you think the levers are so emphatic that there's no real? We can't get the toothpaste back in the tube.
I don't think that there's a way out, and I don't necessarily think that there should be. I mean, I think the rules of the game were set. Just because my side didn't win doesn't mean that we get a do-over. I think there's a good argument to say that once we have some view of what the settlement looks like, that people should have some level of say over that, whether that be through a referendum or through a general election. I don't think there's anything unreasonable about that. But I think that to try to claw back from here, if we're worried about people disliking the establishment, all that will do is stoke further fires, and it would be unfair. The vote went the way that it did. I think Cameron's decision not to invoke Article 50 was probably exactly what I would do in the situation, which is, you made this mess, you figure out how to deal with it, to the next, to the Leavers and to the next party leader. So no, I think Brexit's going to happen. Maybe it shifts to a Norwegian model, which for all intents and purposes would have very little impact, I think, on the country, but I don't think many on the Leave side would be satisfied with. Maybe it shifts to something much more dramatic, but one way or another, it's going to happen.
Did Boris Johnson get more than he bargained for?
The downfall meme that's going around with him as Hitler, frustrated that he accidentally won, is hysterical. If anybody hasn't seen it, I think Boris has made a real mistake. I was a big fan of Boris before all this. I thought he was a great future leader of the party. I think that he has so nakedly put personal ambition in front of what's good for the party and good for the country, that I think that he will deserve the challenges that lie ahead of him.
As Prime Minister?
I don't know. Look, I think the Conservative Party election is going to be fascinating. I think there are some very, very strong and interesting candidates. He may be the one with the greatest name recognition, but and as I say, I'm a conservative. I'll be voting in that election, and I think that you look at people like Stephen Crabb and Sajid Javid, who are both from genuine, real working class type backgrounds, and I think have a lot more of an understanding of what people want. I would love to see the Conservative Party move more in that direction, and I think there may be a really interesting sort of party fight ahead. So I think watch this space.
Okay. Finally, should Corbyn stay or go? Some say that he was acting in his self-interest by not firmly, being in the Remain camp, by not going next to Cameron on the pulpit, urging people to stay. What's your read?
I don't really know what he was thinking, to be honest. I struggle to understand a lot about his motivations. What I will say is this: I'm not a member of the Labour Party, and I don't think it's my business to interfere in their affairs. However, I think that it is in the interest of the Conservative Party and in the interest of the country to have an effective opposition that's well led. The notion of a loyal opposition is one of the most brilliant inventions of parliamentary democracy. 500 years ago, if you were opposed to Her Majesty's government, that meant you got your head chopped off. Nowadays, the notion that you can have this structured, well-led opposition that provides the counter case in a sensible way is just a critical part of how we govern. And it doesn't appear that he's able to provide that right now, and I think that's to the real detriment of the country.
I still think the Speaker's questions and the concept of shadows cabinet is just an amazing thing that I would love to see the U.S. adopt. Just having to defend your position on a regular basis. I understand what you said there. Jeff Lynn of Cedars, it's always a pleasure talking to you. You're well versed in this because your political background, your legal background, your financial background, and the fact that you've been in this country about the same time as I have. So thank you for your perspectives. I really appreciate you coming in.
Thanks very much for having me, Brian.
Great, and Jeff will be answering all of the YouTube comments.
Oh, I'm sure.
Below over the next few days, and if needed be, we'll have you back on and do that. All right.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay.
So much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Real Talk. We'll see you next week on Wednesday. And until then, leave me your comments below. We'll answer them all. And that's it. We're out of here.